Racism in global development is a problem. It is a deep systemic issue.
We like to measure things in global development, but while there are many indices measuring gender equality in the sector, there are none focused on measuring racial equity. The Racial Equity Index is the very first index to measure racial equity in global development and hold the sector accountable for dismantling the systemic racism it was created to uphold.
We are a BIPOC-led collective.
We are global.
We are anti-racist.
Together, we collectively have over 50 years of experience working in the sector.
Every single person in our collective has experienced racism in global development.
The Racial Equity Index is groundbreaking and innovative, and will serve as a metric for the sector in order to reduce harm and make meaningful impact in areas of racial equity.
Success looks like racial equity intentionally incorporated and integrated by organizations in a sustained manner.
Success looks like permanently shifting the dialogue around racial equity in the sector, recognizing that racial inequity and injustices sit at the root of global development.
Success looks like dismantling of systemic racism in global development, and instead creating a more just and equitable sector.
Success looks like more Black, Indigenous, and people of color in senior roles across the sector.
We are
the Racial Equity Index.
Welcome to the Racial Equity Index podcast. This week's episode is yet another unusual recording. As you may have guessed, we do not pre-plan our discussions or what we're going to talk about because, along with all of you, we are experiencing the world as we move through it. And so this week's conversation was centered around supporting individual care within organizations, and if that's even possible or even supported within the global development space and the infrastructure that is in place and kept in place by those in power. We also want to highlight our anniversary event, We Need to Talk, is coming up in a couple of months. Our 2-year anniversary will be at the end of June, beginning of July this year. And we are putting out a call for proposals and panel ideas to all of you. We want to hear what you want to talk about in the most truthful, radical way that the global development sector needs. So, visit the links below to find our Google form and submit your ideas. Thanks so much.
Is around healing and restoration. Mainly because I feel like these are terms that are being used a lot, even in the sector, like in the development sector, of like how important it is for healing and restoration as part of like self-care, which is interesting. I always have feelings about self-care either way, because I kind of feel like self-care is my business. That's my stuff. A company can't actually help me, or an organization can't help me with self-care. An organization has to have organizational care to make space for people to actually have self-care. So I actually think like when an organization talks to me about like, well, self-care is one of our values, it's kind of like, that doesn't really make sense. And yeah, wellness is now, again, wellness is a trigger word for a lot of people because wellness was kind of co-opted by the diet sector. So like wellness became about like bodies and about looking, healing and feeling good in your body. And I'm sure you guys see this a lot also. It's just like wellness being on Instagram or TikTok follow people who are like, oh, it's really coming to center with your body. And it's like, wellness is so many more things than that, because like you're not taking into account all the intersectional ways in this space that people like come into a space. And it's been co-opted by white women. And Alyssa, I love that point where a self and a collective care are really grounded in the intersectional feminist frameworks. Yeah, that's really what I'm spending a lot of time thinking about in my organization, is how do we truly create an organization because I don't think you can talk about wellness and healing and restoration for others until you actually have that in your own space. So I think about that a lot. And what does that mean for a sector that is literally built on the backs of people of color's work, and not just passion of work, but for their own survival?
My organization recently sent out these things called well boxes, and they're like for corporate organizations to send to their employees of wellness products. And it's like a snack bar and the essential oil and eye gel mask, which granted I will use it, but but it was in this whole like, this is our way of showing that we care about you, when in reality I think all of us would have much rather that they spent the money on, or like given us extra money, than to have sent us a box of things to show or to help us be more well.
Alyssa, I want to read your points as well. Alyssa's writing, and I think we need to talk about self and collective care as one. There's a lot of emphasis on self-care, and I think that ties into individualism. We need to start prioritizing collective care, especially in organizational settings. And then she writes, individualism as though self-care is our own responsibility and is not impeded at times by structural inequalities that many people are faced with. And this is where it comes back into, Chantel, what you were saying, like as organizations and even as collectives that are within an organizational setting, like, do you even have organizational policies and programs that support the individual, right? So do you have, are people getting paid a living wage so that they could even be able to, for example, afford a therapist? Do you have fully covered health, dental, and vision insurance? Do you have gender-based violence paid and protected leave? Do you have unlimited menstrual leave for people with uteruses? Do you have a professional growth stipend? Do you have like a stipend to help you build wealth and 401k matching? You know, like do you have those things that are basic but also essential so that people can start off in a place where we can be like, oh, we actually have space to take a deep breath and think about what our self-care would look like, because we are supported as individuals within this organization.
Yeah, and I think, what's interesting is like I work in an organization that is reliant on funder money, and we can't do a lot of those things because of the, restrictions we have in funding by funders, like a certain bucket amount of money is allowed to do the structural systemic changes. And I think this is very similar to kind of just like the conversation about, racial equity in the sector. Is like putting a Band-Aid on a festering wound, on gangrene, of just like, we can't actually truly have a collective care or even an organizational structure for true care unless we have the money to sustain it. And and also, foundations need to effectively institute this in their own work of really thinking about, what are the things that our staff need or want? Because the thing is also just ask. I think, Alyssa, you made that point. Like, ask your staff, like, what are the practices that they want to see in the organization, not just leadership, but like really all levels of staff, to get a sense of like, what does it look like to actually create a culture of care? Why isn't it part of our funding streams? Why isn't there a space of, yes, of course, salaries, but they also, funders limit how much you can put in your salaries, and there's like, only a certain percentage of the money can go to salaries, which is always ironic because the whole entire work is people. So paying people is the work. But on top of that is like, why can't we actually have a whole bucket of money of just like staff care, just taking care of our staff, and making sure that we have structures in place to take care of our staff? Well, Alyssa made some really good points around like talking about the context, talk about what this means in the context of COVID-19. The care burden for BIPOC women has increased tremendously. The need for collective care in organizational settings is more urgent than ever. And making sure our workloads are reasonable. And what does it mean to have a reasonable workload? Honestly, like I spend a lot of time thinking about this too. If just like, I kind of feel like a reasonable workload is not what I want. I want a low workload because I've been working at, unreasonable for a really long time. And I feel like back pay is necessary. I want a very low workload now.
And this is the workloads pacings have been set by people and by the benchmarks of capitalism, which is not humane. And so when we take matters into our own hand and say, here's what an actual human workload looks like, it usually means a pay cut for people. By saying like, here's what I actually need to live and feel like I'm human in this work setting. It usually means that we have to take a pay cut in order to achieve that, because what is centered as like, here's what your job requires is not actually humane. A lot to talk about in this.
Yeah, but it's also interesting because it is a big part of this work, right? Like I keep thinking about it in relationship, like all of these conversations we're having can directly connect back to a conversation around racial equity. Like we cannot separate all of this from what it means to have a racially equitable space, because the burden of care falls predominantly on BIPOC, female identified humans and women identified humans. And I think it's really difficult to assume that somehow we'll fix ourselves, or just by giving a stipend for self-care that we'll be fine, because we don't even get to use it. If I'm working 40 hours a week, but let's be real, more than that, but even 40 hours a week doesn't make any sense. Who made up this number? It is literally the dumbest number. I feel like we have not progressed since the time of like all these labor laws and the fights that people were having of like moving the 80-hour week down to a 40-hour week, and then we just stayed here. And I don't understand how we're not willing to adapt or evolve there. And you'd assume, honestly, that the global development sector would be the place where a lot of this evolution happened. But I feel like we follow mainly the tech sector, where it's like, make the workplace a place where people want to stay.
Considering as well, this is International Women's History Month, right? And it was International Women's Day on the 8th of March. A lot of this talk, and Chantal, you would just raise this point, so many of these issues come back down to racial equity, which impacts BIPOC women. But at the same time, this sector and just this past week on Twitter, the Gates Foundation had released this poll: what gender equality issue do you want to talk about, or to learn more about, in 2022? And they had childcare, financial services, gender data, and family planning. And we, as a collective, had tweeted saying that it's 2022, and we shouldn't be talking about gender equality without racial equity being one of the key issues to learn about and measure, because we can't achieve gender equality without an understanding of how intersecting identities impact women's experiences in the world. But this is 2022. Do we really need to be saying that racial equity needs to be at the core of gender equality learnings and data collection and all of it? But apparently, yes, we do need to have that conversation still. And the thing is, it's like, if leaders in this space are talking about gender equality without even mentioning racial equity, we are so woefully behind any of the conversations that we need to have, even because this all trickles down, right? This is, if we're looking at gender equality this way, this is how we're looking then at organizational dynamics and workplace culture through this index of like, is it protecting the gender equality in this space? But if we're not feeding in racial equity to every single one of those conversations and centering it, we're so woefully behind.
Honestly, the fact that we've been you're having a conversation about childcare and you're not bringing up racial equity is madness. You cannot have a conversation about childcare without talking about the fact that BIPOC people take care of people's children. Like the amount of work that they're taking care of other people's children and our own children. That also, like, you can't really talk about this without talking about the fact that girls in gender expensive youth take care of children. They have the extra load. And it's not something that's happening, in sub-Saharan Africa alone. It happens here in the States, like over and over again. There's so much data there's not that much data on this because no one wants to study it, but my organization studied it. And we found like during COVID-19, there was a 44% increase in the additional responsibilities for childcare, for taking care of siblings or taking care of not even just children, like taking care of elders, taking care of other people in your household during COVID-19. And this is experiences of girls in gender expensive youth, predominantly of color. Like, we've hit a point where it just seems really silly the way we're having these conversations, because it just seems like we have not evolved. The world is, as much as the world changes, a lot of the things have stayed the same. And I just don't think we can have a conversation about these issues without talking about how necessary it is to come from from honestly a conversation of equity. I'm tired of talking about equality because it just seems like, really, we want to go back, like an equity conversation or even a justice conversation. Maybe we're not there yet, but at least we could try. But you have to talk about it from an intersectional feminist lens.
We're still having these conversations, and we still have to keep reminding people to even talk about racial equity, not even center it, just talk about it.
I don't even think it's a reminder anymore. I kind of feel like it's reteaching people every time.
Yeah.
I think it didn't get through the first time.
Yeah.
Because if people really care, you shouldn't have to remind them.
That's it.
People don't remind me to brush my teeth. Well, I mean, they did, but that's because I didn't care about it for the longest time until like I got cavities and I was like, this is the worst. And now I care about it. You don't remind people about things that they care about. If we have to remind them, it's because they never cared in the first place.
I think we end there for our podcast, but I want to say thank you to you, Chantel, and then thank you to Alyssa and Graciana, who had to drop off, for being a part of this conversation. Alyssa on Zoom chat because she was in a loud space, and Graciana as well. But thank you.
Of course.